Hello lovers. Eleanor here. Tonight, we will embark on a journey that begins not with the roar of armies or the marble halls of Rome, but in a quieter place. Right here, in the silence of my own living room. The clock ticks steadily on the wall, reminding me of the hours that slip away. The chair beside me has been empty for far too long. And sometimes the weight of that absence presses more heavily than I can bear. Loneliness, you see, has a way of whispering in the dark. Whispering doubts, regrets, memories. And on nights like this, I find myself reaching for stories, for the voices of the past, as if they could fill the silence with something greater than myself. Tonight, I want to share with you the story of a man who knew loneliness in its deepest form. His name was Marcus Junius Brutus. You know him, perhaps, only from a line in Shakespeare. Et tu, Brute? The supposed betrayal of Julius Caesar. But history is never so simple. Was Brutus a traitor? Or was he, in his own tortured way, the last defender of a fragile republic? If you enjoy these journeys through time, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And I'd love to hear from you. Share with me a story from history that has always made you stop and wonder. Now, settle in comfortably, close your eyes, and let's travel back in time with Eleanor. The world we enter is Rome in the final days of the Republic. A city that smelled of triumph and fear all at once. It is strange, isn't it? How one city could command so much of the known world, yet be so afraid of itself. The marble columns gleamed in the sunlight, but in the Senate halls, shadows gathered. Caesar had returned from his victories. Gaul was his conquest, the Rubicon his defiance, Pompey his vanquished rival. And yet, with every laurel placed upon his brow, the Senate trembled, for they sensed a king rising where once there had only been men of the Republic. And Brutus, Brutus, was at the very center of this trembling. He was no mere conspirator plucked from obscurity. He was, in fact, the very picture of Roman nobility. Descended from the Brutus who, centuries earlier, had driven out the tyrant Tarquin and founded the Republic. Imagine that weight upon your shoulders. To be born into a name that meant freedom. To be told since childhood that your very blood was the blood of liberty. And yet, Brutus loved Caesar. Or at least, he respected him as a friend, even as a father. Caesar had spared his life after Pharsalus, brought him into his confidence, and perhaps even trusted him more than any other man. So, here was the torment. How does a man reconcile his duty to the Republic with his devotion to a friend? I sometimes wonder, in my loneliest hours, whether Brutus saw in Caesar what I once saw in my late husband. Strength, brilliance, a presence that steadied the world. And yet, as love can sometimes smother, so too can power. There's a curious irony here. Brutus was not the fiercest of the conspirators. He was the most hesitant. Cassius, hot-tempered and jealous, whispered poison into his ears. Others spoke of tyranny, of chains around the necks of senators. But it was Brutus they needed. For without his noble name, the plot would seem a petty vendetta. His very honor became the mask behind which daggers could be drawn. I wonder, have you ever been torn between loyalty and principle? Between the comfort of someone you loved and the larger truth that pressed on your conscience? It is not a choice that leaves a person whole. Brutus must have lain awake many nights, as I do, staring into the darkness, hearing not answers but echoes. Did the Republic truly need saving? Or did his fellow senators simply envy Caesar's glory? Historians still debate it. Some say Brutus was blinded by philosophy, by those lofty ideals he studied from the Greeks, that liberty was worth any sacrifice. Others suggest he was manipulated, a man too gentle to see through the bitterness of his peers. But the fact remains. He agreed. The man who owed his life to Caesar became the man who would plan his death. And isn't that the most haunting part of all? To love someone, and yet to believe the world would be better without them. That paradox chills me, just as this empty house does when the night grows deep. I, too, have known the cruel pull of contradiction. Missing my husband, yet resenting the shadow of his absence. We humans are so rarely simple. So, the stage is set. Rome bustled by day, but in the night, secret meetings flickered like candle flames. Cassius and his circle sharpened their daggers not just on whetstones, but on words. And all the while, Brutus stood at the crossroads of history, torn between two fathers. Caesar, the man of flesh and trust, and the Republic, the father of ideals and laws. It is here, in this tension, that we leave him for now. A man walking in the corridors of power, carrying a name too heavy for his heart, and hearing whispers that would soon drown out every other sound. The city of Rome in those days was a place of spectacle and suspicion. I can almost hear the noise of the forum, the clamor of merchants, the echo of sandals on stone, the shouts of soldiers returning home. Yet beneath it all ran an undercurrent of fear, like a stream flowing dark beneath the cobblestones. Rome had seen strong men before. Marius, Sulla, Pompey. But Caesar was something different. He was adored by the people, feared by the Senate, and, perhaps most dangerous of all, he had begun to see himself as indispensable. I imagine Brutus, in those restless days, standing on the steps of the Curia, gazing at the crowds. Did he see freedom in their cheers? Or did he see chains being forged with every shout of "Av Caesar"? It is the cruel irony of power. The more the people love you, the more others whisper of tyranny. The rumor spread quickly. Dictator for life. A crown at the Lupercalia. Whispers of kingship in a republic that had killed its last kings centuries before. And Caesar, whether out of vanity or strategy, did little to quiet the rumors. He let Antony hold out a crown before the crowd, refusing it with a flourish, but not so forcefully as to silence the idea. Was it theater? Was it a test? Even now, historians argue. But to the senators, it was like watching a door creak open to monarchy. And then there was Cassius. Oh, Cassius. Sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued, a man who had long simmered with resentment. He knew how to dig at Brutus's doubts. He reminded him of his ancestor who had struck down the tyrant Tarquin. He whispered of Caesar's ambition. He even arranged, some say, for forged letters to appear on Brutus's desk. Pleas from the people calling on him to save the Republic. Imagine the cruelty of it. A man already torn apart, tricked by scraps of parchment left to deepen his torment. I confess, I feel for Brutus here. Loneliness, my dear listeners, is not only the absence of others. It is also the absence of clarity. I know this too well. Since my husband passed, I have found myself talking to shadows, reading too much into the silence of an empty house. Brutus, in his loneliness, must have heard those whispers louder than truth itself. But there was another side to him, too. a philosopher's heart. He had studied under Stoic teachers, and he believed, perhaps naively, that virtue and duty stood above personal affection. What does one do when love for a man collides with love for an ideal? It's easy to pass judgment from centuries away. But in his shoes, would we have chosen differently? One story often overlooked is that of Servilia, Brutus's mother. She had been Caesar's lover once, and some whispered that Brutus was even his son. We may never know if that was true. But imagine the gossip, the cruel speculation. Brutus caught between bloodlines and loyalties, a pawn of history long before he wielded a dagger. How could any man bear such contradictions? By early 44 BCE, the tension was unbearable. Caesar had been named Dictator Perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. Rome had not heard such a title before, and the Senate bristled. The conspirators gathered in secret, their plan forming in candlelit chambers, daggers hidden beneath cloaks. Cassius urged haste. Others wavered. But all eyes turned to Brutus. Because Brutus's presence would make the murder seem less like revenge and more like justice. His name was a banner, his honor a shield. Without him, the plot would look like treachery. With him, it could look like salvation. And so, Brutus agreed. Quietly, reluctantly, with a heart heavier than the blade he would soon raise. I wonder, did he tell himself it was for Rome? Or did he simply surrender, too weary to resist the tide? That, my friends, is the tragedy. Brutus was not the architect of Caesar's doom, but the one who gave it legitimacy. His struggle was not only with Caesar but with himself. And the moment he stepped into the circle of conspirators, he crossed a line that no Roman could ever retreat from. It is strange, isn't it? That a decision made in the silence of one man's chamber can echo through centuries. A decision born of fear, love, and confusion. So very human, yet so catastrophic. As I sit here tonight, I think of Brutus walking back to his home after such meetings. His sandals scraping the stones of Rome. His eyes searching the sky for answers the stars would not give. I know that feeling. The house empty. The bed cold. The silence louder than any crowd. Perhaps, in that loneliness, Brutus and I are not so far apart. The morning of the Ides of March dawned with a deceptive calm. The city stirred as always. Vendors setting up their stalls. Senators donning their white togas. The hum of voices rising like the dawn mist. Yet for Brutus, the air must have felt heavy, thick with the weight of what was to come. He had committed himself, and now there was no turning back. I imagine his walk to the Senate that day. The streets of Rome, with their worn stones and towering arches, had seen processions, victories, funerals. But never such a quiet procession of men carrying daggers under their garments. Brutus was one among them. But his presence gave the group an air of righteousness. He was not only a conspirator. He was the emblem of a republic gasping for a breath. The Senate meeting was to be held not in the Grand Curia, but in Pompey's theater, while renovations were underway. The irony is bitter, isn't it? The man Caesar had defeated, his rival Pompey, now lent his very hall as the stage for Caesar's death. History, my loves, has a way of arranging its tragedies with cruel symmetry. Caesar entered, draped in his purple, the color of kings. Accounts tell us he was warned. His wife Calpurnia had begged him not to go. Dreams of blood and omens lingering in her voice. A soothsayer had whispered, "Beware the Ides of March." But Caesar, proud and dismissive, ignored them all. The Ides have come, he is said to have remarked, but not gone. How often have we brushed aside warnings, too sure of our own invincibility? And then the circle closed in. Senators with friendly faces, men Caesar had trusted, surrounded him under the guise of presenting petitions. At first, confusion. Then, the flash of steel. One blade, then another, and another. Chaos erupted. The chamber filled with gasps, shouts, the scrape of sandals. Brutus stood among them, dagger in hand. Did his grip falter? Did his heart pound in his ears? We cannot know. What we do know is that he struck. Not first, not last, but enough. And when Caesar saw him, oh, when their eyes met, history froze. The words have echoed through centuries. Et tu, Brute? Some say he spoke them. Others say he did not. Perhaps it was silence. Perhaps it was only a look of recognition, of betrayal deeper than any wound. Whether spoken or not, those words haunt us, don't they? Because betrayal by an enemy is one thing, but betrayal by a friend is unbearable. And Caesar fell, bleeding at the base of Pompey's statue. The symbolism is staggering. The conqueror of Pompey dying at his feet. Rome's most powerful man crumpled like any mortal. In that moment, the Republic's fate seemed rewritten. But what did Brutus feel as he stood there, dagger wet? The Senate in uproar. Relief? Horror? Or nothing at all? Numbness protecting him from the enormity of his act? I think of nights when grief numbs me. When I sit staring at a photograph of my husband, unable to feel anything at all. Perhaps Brutus felt the same. Suspended. Emptied. Waiting for reality to crash down. And reality did crash down. For though the conspirators thought the people would hail them as liberators, the reaction was not so simple. The crowd recoiled at the sight of Caesar's corpse. Blood pooled across the Senate floor. And with it, Rome's illusions of order. The conspirators raised their daggers and declared freedom. But what is freedom bought with murder? Did the people see saviors before them? Or butchers cloaked in righteousness? Even in my little town, when there's a scandal or betrayal, the truth is never clean. Half the neighbors whisper one way, half the other, and no one agrees who was right. Imagine that on the scale of an empire. Brutus tried to speak, to reason, to remind them of the Republic's glory. But words are weak when stained with blood. Even his voice, eloquent though it was, could not cut through the roar of uncertainty. That day, a man was slain. But so too was trust. In leaders. In ideals. In Rome itself. And in that fracture, the shadows of civil war began to stir. After the dagger fell silent, Brutus and the conspirators stood in a haze of triumph and unease. They had slain a man they called a tyrant. Yet the echo of their blades resounded louder than their cause. Imagine the Senate chamber after the deed. Marble walls splattered. Robes stained. And Pompey's statue looming. Silent witness to Rome's darkest drama. The senators fled in terror. Some leaving their sandals behind as they ran. The city outside buzzed with rumors. Caesar was dead. Struck down not by barbarians. Not by enemies at the gates. But by the very men he had once called allies. Brutus stepped forward, trying to steady the trembling republic. He raised his bloodied hands to speak. To remind Rome that this was no murder but a liberation. We are not tyrannicides, he might have told himself. But physicians curing the body of Rome. How fragile those words must have sounded in the air thick with iron and death. They marched through the streets, daggers lifted high. Cicero, the great orator, was said to have approved in principle, seeing in it the return of the republic he cherished. But approval is not allegiance. Many others watched with wary eyes, fearful of chaos, longing for stability, even if it wore Caesar's name. That night, I picture Brutus at home. Perhaps he could not eat, the metallic smell of blood still clinging to his hands. Did he sit in the dark, listening for the sounds of unrest outside? Or did he, exhausted, whisper to himself that history would absolve him? Oh, how often we cling to that fragile hope, that future generations will understand the pain of the choices we make. I've done the same, sitting in my lonely kitchen, telling myself that the emptiness of these nights will make sense one day. But history, my dear listeners, is rarely so merciful. The funeral of Caesar would prove this. His body was laid before the Roman people, wounds laid bare, the crimson cloak soaked with betrayal. Antony, ever the showman, seized the moment. His words burned hotter than the funeral pyre. You loved him once. Why not now? He stirred grief into rage, rage into vengeance. The mob surged, overturning benches, seizing firebrands, carrying Caesar's body aloft. They burned what they could, even threatening the homes of the conspirators. Brutus had thought Rome would greet him as a liberator. Instead, he became a fugitive in his own city. The name tyrant slayer did not echo with glory but with bitterness and confusion. And yet, he still believed. Still, he held that the Republic could be restored. That his blade had opened not a wound but a path. That faith was his strength. And perhaps also his blindness. For as the streets boiled with fury, as Caesar's heir Octavian quietly prepared his ascent, Brutus was already caught in a storm too vast for one man's conscience. I cannot help but think. Was Brutus naive? Or noble? Perhaps both. Perhaps the nobility of conviction is always shadowed by a blindness to consequence. And isn't that true for all of us? In our loneliest moments, when we act out of desperation or love or fear, we cannot see the ripples that spread outward. We can only hope. And Brutus, poor Brutus, was now a man of hope adrift in a Rome that no longer belonged to him. The dream of liberty unraveled quickly. Brutus and his fellow conspirators found themselves not as saviors but as exiles, their daggers unable to cut through the fury of the Roman crowd. In the aftermath of Caesar's funeral, the air of the city turned thick with danger. What had begun as a vision of freedom now resembled a nightmare of mobs, flames, and vengeance. Brutus withdrew, seeking safety in the countryside. But safety was fragile. His letters to Cicero and others reveal a man still convinced of the righteousness of his deed. He believed that time and reason would bring the people to understand. We acted for Rome, he told himself. But the streets of Rome had already chosen their next masters. Antony, with his charisma and cunning, and Octavian, the young heir with Caesar's blood, were not enemies to be underestimated. I imagine Brutus sitting in his villa, staring at the olive groves under the harsh Italian sun. Perhaps he tried to quiet his thoughts by reading the old philosophers, clinging to Stoic teachings of virtue and duty. Yet even the wisdom of Seneca could not silence the sound of Rome's voices, demanding justice, demanding order, demanding blood. And here is the irony that history loves to weave. In killing Caesar to save the Republic, Brutus had cracked open the very path to empire. For Rome did not crave liberty. It craved stability. And stability would come not from a senate of equals but from one man with absolute power. The Republic, already fragile, was bleeding out faster than Caesar on the floor of the Curia. When Brutus and Cassius fled east to gather armies, it was not the march of heroes but the retreat of hunted men. They called upon allies in Greece and Asia Minor, raising legions under the banner of liberty. Yet, liberty begins to sound hollow when bought with coin and mercenaries. What, then, did Brutus see in his dreams? Did he see Caesar's face? Betrayed? Bewildered? Or did he see Rome's people, slipping from his grasp like sand through open fingers? I sometimes ask myself a similar question, here in my solitude. When we act, believing with all our heart that we are right, how long does it take before doubt creeps in? Nights stretch long in silence, and the mind whispers, perhaps we were wrong. Still, Brutus carried himself with dignity. His soldiers loved him, seeing in him a commander who walked among them, who shared their rations, who carried himself not as a tyrant but as one of their own. Loyalty bound them, though history would test that loyalty soon enough. Meanwhile, Antony and Octavian forged an uneasy alliance. The second triumvirate. Enemies one day, partners the next. They joined forces against the liberators. It was a pact of necessity, and Rome would drown in its consequences. Proscriptions, purges, names carved into death lists. Cicero himself would fall to Antony's vengeance, his tongue cut out, his hands nailed to the rostra. Brutus, hearing of this, must have felt the weight of inevitability pressing upon him. The republic he sought to save was vanishing in blood and fire, replaced by warlords carving Rome as spoils. And yet, he did not turn back. He still believed that one decisive stand, one battle of justice, might restore what had been lost. Isn't it haunting, dear listeners, how we cling to hope long after reason tells us to let go? Like a widow keeping the empty chair at her table, or a teacher saving a desk for a student who never returns. Brutus clung to the Republic, not as it was, but as he wished it to be. That is the tragedy of conviction. And so, the stage shifted eastward, where armies gathered like storm clouds. The world's eyes turned to Macedonia, where Brutus and Cassius prepared to face Antony and Octavian. It was no longer just a clash of men but of visions. Freedom against control. Principle against ambition. But history, like the battlefield, is rarely so clear-cut. Brutus, the philosopher with blood on his hands, was marching toward a destiny that even his stoic calm could not soften. The clash was inevitable. Macedonia became the stage upon which Rome's future would be decided. Brutus and Cassius gathered their forces, some 80,000 strong, while Antony and Octavian marched with legions seasoned by years of Caesar's wars. Two visions of Rome stood poised to meet. The old dream of a Senate-led republic against the rising tide of single rulers cloaked in populist promises. I picture Brutus the night before the Battle of Philippi. He likely stood in his tent, the flickering lamplight casting sharp lines across his weary face. His men slept nearby, their shields stacked like silent prayers against chaos. Brutus may have whispered to himself fragments of philosophy, repeating the Stoic creed that fate is beyond our control, but virtue lies in our choices. Yet even the strongest creed quivers in the face of dawn. The battle unfolded in confusion. Cassius, ever the realist, feared the worst. His forces faltered, his cavalry overwhelmed, and in despair he took his own life, mistaking retreat for defeat. It was a bitter irony. He who mistrusted Brutus's idealism died believing hope was lost when in fact Brutus was gaining ground on the other wing. Two men bound by a common cause. Undone by the cruel timing of war. Brutus, upon hearing of Cassius's death, carried himself with remarkable calm. To his men, he spoke of honor, of duty, of pressing forward. But inside? Inside, I think the foundation of his resolve cracked a little. Cassius was not just an ally. He was the sharp mind that balanced Brutus's lofty ideals. Without him, Brutus was alone, and the weight of the Republic rested heavier on his shoulders. The second battle sealed his fate. Antony's brilliance and Octavian's persistence ground down Brutus's exhausted troops. The once loyal legions began to waver. Betrayal crept in. The same knives that struck Caesar now turned away from their so-called liberators. Rome had made her choice. And it was not liberty. Brutus, seeing the tide irreversible, withdrew. With a few companions, he fled the field, carrying neither triumph nor hope. There, in the shadow of Macedonia's hills, he made his final choice. Surrounded by loyal friends, he ordered one to hold his sword. And with steady steps, Brutus fell upon it. Virtue, he might have thought, demands courage in life and dignity in death. Thus ended the life of Marcus Junius Brutus, the man who killed Caesar in the name of freedom, only to die abandoned by the very people he sought to save. I confess, as I tell you this, my chest tightens. How often do we pour our hearts into noble causes, only to find the world unmoved, or worse, hostile? Brutus's tragedy is not only his own. It echoes in every teacher dismissed by restless students, in every widow whose sacrifices go unnoticed, in every soul who stands for principle while others seek only comfort. When I sit here in my quiet kitchen, alone with the ticking clock and the hum of the refrigerator, I think of Brutus's last night. He, too, must have heard silence pressing in, broken only by the rustle of leaves or the murmur of companions too weary to speak. The loneliness of conviction is a heavy cloak. He bore it to the end. And yet, history remembers him not only for his end but for the questions he left us. Was he a patriot or a murderer? A defender of freedom or the very force that unleashed tyranny? The answer, like the man himself, is complex. Perhaps it lies in the space between intent and outcome, between the purity of ideals and the mess of human action. Rome moved on. Antony celebrated victory. Octavian bided his time to rise higher still. The Republic was gone, replaced by the slow birth of empire. But Brutus's name lingered, like an echo in the marble halls, reminding future generations that even the noblest hearts can falter. And that freedom, once lost, is not so easily reclaimed. Brutus's death was not the end of his story. In some ways, it was only the beginning of his legend. News of his suicide spread swiftly through the Roman world. For Antony and Octavian, it meant the final obstacle to their dominance had fallen. For the senators and intellectuals of Rome, however, Brutus became something else entirely. An image, almost a ghost, of what the Republic once was. Imagine the whispers in Rome's marble courtyards. Brutus died for liberty, others scoffed. Brutus destroyed the Republic by plunging it into civil war. History's stage is always crowded with voices, and his name echoed between admiration and condemnation. Antony, ever the dramatist, ordered Brutus's body treated with respect. He draped it with his own cloak, ensuring the man who had betrayed Caesar would not be dishonored in death. Some call that hypocrisy. Others call it recognition. Perhaps Antony saw in Brutus a reflection of his own ambition. A man driven by forces larger than himself. Octavian, calculating as always, remained silent. He had no need to praise Brutus. Time would erase him soon enough. But the poets and philosophers would not forget. Plutarch centuries later would write of Brutus's nobility, of his incorruptible character, of his tragic devotion to a dying ideal. Dante would place him deep in hell beside Judas, forever chewed in Satan's jaws. A traitor to his benefactor. Shakespeare, with his pen centuries afterward, would immortalize him as the noblest Roman of them all. 3 portraits. 3 verdicts. Patriot. Traitor. Martyr. Which is true? Or are they all fragments of a man whose life cannot be caged by one word? I sometimes wonder what Brutus himself would think, knowing his name became a battlefield of memory. Would he be comforted by the poets who painted him noble? Or tormented by the theologians who damned him as the worst of traitors? Perhaps, as a Stoic, he would shrug, insisting that reputation lies beyond our control, and only virtue matters. But oh, what a lonely comfort that must be. Sitting here in my armchair, the shadows stretching long across the walls, I can feel a kinship with Brutus's ghost. To be remembered, but never fully understood. That is a burden many of us carry, isn't it? A widow left behind. Her sacrifice is unseen. A teacher whose words echo faintly after the classroom empties. The world makes its judgments. Not always fairly. Not always kindly. Yet Brutus endures because he forces us to ask. What do we value more? Loyalty to a friend or loyalty to an ideal? He chose the ideal. And in doing so lost both. His story reminds us that history is not written in black and white but in shadows and contradictions. Even now, when I close my eyes, I picture his shade walking the quiet hills of Philippi, searching for the republic that slipped through his fingers. Perhaps that is the true tragedy. That he died not only for a dream but also with the realization that the dream had already vanished after the dust settled and Brutus's body returned to Rome. The empire to be moved quickly to reshape his legacy. You see, history is never just about facts. It's also about who controls the story. And the victors. The alliance of Octavian and Antony knew this well. They understood that memory could be wielded like a weapon. In the years that followed, Rome carefully painted Brutus not simply as an assassin but as a man whose actions accelerated the death of the Republic. Octavian, especially, had no interest in elevating Brutus as a martyr. His rise depended on framing himself as the savior who would bring order after chaos. To glorify Brutus would have been to undermine his own future. And yet, among intellectuals, Brutus's reputation refused to be buried. Cicero had long admired him, even before the assassination, for his philosophy and sense of justice. In letters that survived, Cicero praised him as a man of integrity. Later, Stoic thinkers held him up as an example of the statesman torn between personal loyalty and civic duty. For them, his suicide at Philippi wasn't cowardice but a final act of fidelity to principle. To die with dignity rather than live in dishonor. Centuries passed, and Brutus became a mirror for every age's anxieties. In Dante's Divine Comedy, written in the Middle Ages, Brutus was condemned to hell itself, his punishment eternal for betraying his benefactor. To Dante's Christian worldview, loyalty to a man like Caesar trumped loyalty to political ideals. Then, in the Renaissance, Shakespeare recast him once more. This time as the noblest Roman of them all. Think of how powerful that is. A man once damned in literature became celebrated as a tragic hero. A figure whose moral dilemma captured the imagination of audiences for centuries. And perhaps the strangest twist of all, Brutus has been invoked in modern revolutions. Leaders struggling against tyranny have pointed to his dagger as a symbol of resistance, while others cite him as a warning against political violence. Patriot or betrayer? Visionary or villain? The question remains unsettled. I find myself lingering on this thought tonight. How easily memory reshapes itself depending on who tells the story. When my husband passed away, I remember how neighbors spoke about him. Some called him a devoted family man. Others remembered only his sternness. Both were true. And yet neither held the whole of him. Isn't that the tragedy of all human lives? That we are never remembered in full, but in fragments chosen by others. Brutus lives on in fragments, too. His daggers gleam in plays. His name weighs heavy in poems. His ghost haunts philosophy. He became both warning and inspiration. And so, in every retelling, he lives again. Not as flesh and blood, but as an idea. I sometimes wonder, would Brutus have chosen differently if he had known his legacy would splinter this way? Or was his destiny always to become less a man and more a symbol? Endlessly debated but never fully grasped? The deeper I sink into the quiet of tonight, the more I feel the pull of history's unanswered questions. And Brutus, poor Brutus, remains among the most enduring puzzles. Was he, as Antony thundered, a traitor whose hands dripped with the blood of his benefactor? Or was he the noble Roman Shakespeare saw? A man who sacrificed personal loyalty to defend the fragile flame of the Republic? You see, Brutus's choice forces us into uncomfortable reflection. When is it just to betray a friend? When is it righteous to defy authority? For some, the very act of raising a dagger against Caesar was an abomination, forever staining his name. For others, it was a desperate bid to halt the creeping shadow of tyranny before it swallowed Rome whole. But here is where the paradox grows heavy. Caesar himself had once fought to free Rome from domination by others. He had been the outsider challenging entrenched power. By the time of his murder, however, many saw him not as liberator but as would-be king. Was Brutus defending liberty? Or merely grasping at illusions? Too late to save what had already died. I imagine him in those final hours, tormented by both loyalty and fear. Perhaps his heart whispered, "Stay with Caesar, the man who trusted you." But another voice, colder, sterner, urged, "Think of Rome. Think of the Republic." How many of us have felt that tearing inside? Between affection for someone dear and duty to something greater. What stirs me most, though, is the aftermath. The Republic, even with Brutus's sacrifice, did not survive. His daggers carved Caesar's body, but they could not carve away ambition or chaos. In the years that followed, civil wars raged, and Octavian rose. Not to restore the Republic, but to crown himself Augustus, the first emperor. If Brutus fought for freedom, then history betrayed him. And yet, his name lives on because of this haunting tension. Betrayer or savior, villain or patriot, coward or noble Roman. Each label captures only a sliver of him. And perhaps that is why he lingers so powerfully in memory. Because he embodies the conflict inside us all. The impossible choice between heart and principle. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the friends I've lost. Arguments that drove wedges. Pride that silenced forgiveness. When I sit alone, I wonder, was I Brutus in those moments? Did I wound people I loved in the name of something I believed greater? And if so, was it worth it? As I cradle my teacup, still warm in these fragile hands, I sigh and whisper. History never answers us cleanly. It only leaves us with mirrors. And in Brutus's mirror, I see both betrayal and devotion, cruelty and courage, love and fear. He was, in the end, human. And maybe that's the truest legacy of all. The clock ticks softly in my quiet room, and I feel the story reaching its gentle end. Brutus stands in history not as a clean figure, but as a shadow, blurred at the edges, both feared and admired. His daggers struck down Caesar, but in striking, they also carved away the dream he longed to protect. How tragically ironic. He killed a man to save the Republic, only for that Republic to slip away like sand through his fingers. And yet, when I think of him, I do not see only the cold steel. I see a man sitting awake at night, torn by voices that pulled him in opposite directions. Duty to Rome, love for Caesar, fear of tyranny, fear of regret. I picture him as I sometimes picture myself, awake in the long hours of loneliness, listening to echoes of choices past. History calls Brutus both hero and traitor. But maybe we should call him something simpler. Human. Because isn't that what we are? In the end. Torn. Imperfect. Stumbling forward with hearts divided and eyes fixed on a future we cannot clearly see. And perhaps that is why he lingers so strongly. Not because he was flawless, but because he reminds us of the fractures inside all of us. The moments we must choose between loyalty and conviction, love and justice. So, when you next hear his name whispered in classrooms or see it carved into old stone, remember not only the assassin, but also the man. Remember the trembling hands, the restless nights, the impossible choice. Remember him as a mirror, reflecting back the difficult questions we still ask today. And now, my dear ones, let us close this capsule of time together. May your dreams tonight be soft, yet filled with the haunting beauty of history, where heroes and traitors often share the same face. May Brutus walk through those dreams not as a villain or saint, but as a fellow traveler on this uncertain road we call life.